History is being rewritten not by the spade, but by the dictionary. For centuries, the epic tales of the world's first empires have been built on a fragile foundation, the translated words of ancient kings. But a revolution is quietly unfolding in libraries and labs, where newly translated royal inscriptions are shattering our oldest stories. This journey will show you how a single reinterpreted word can collapse a dynasty's reputation or uncover a lost network of ideas that connected entire continents. You will witness the map of early civilization redrawn in real time. How did a mysterious sea people transform from invaders into refugees with just a few grammatical clues? Why were the most brutal boasts of an empire actually a sophisticated propaganda campaign? The answers lie in stone and clay, waiting for their true voice. What does it mean when the past suddenly changes its story? These stone and clay tablets were the original social media feeds of antiquity, carved not for fleeting likes but for eternal glory. Think of a towering monument beside a busy road, or a clay cylinder buried in a temple's foundations. These were the posts of kings, broadcasting their greatest victories, their new laws, and their intimate conversations with the gods to both their subjects and the distant future. They are primary sources in the truest sense, the unmediated voice of power from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. But for most of history, that voice has been muffled, locked behind a formidable barrier of forgotten languages and cryptic symbols. The act of translating these inscriptions is far more than a simple swap of ancient words for modern ones. It is a high-stakes act of interpretation, a delicate archaeological dig conducted on the page itself. Every grammatical ending, every poetic metaphor, every choice of verb tense holds immense weight. A single mistranslated term can accidentally demote a respected ally to a lowly servant, or reinterpret a cautious diplomatic letter as a blatant threat. The entire narrative of a relationship between two empires can pivot on the understanding of one elusive word. This is why the new wave of translations feels so revolutionary. The breakthroughs are not coming from one brilliant scholar working alone, but from a convergence of modern tools. Vast digital databases now allow researchers to cross-reference a puzzling phrase against thousands of other texts in an instant, spotting patterns no human could hold in memory. Our grasp of ancient grammar has deepened, revealing nuances of mood and emphasis that were previously invisible. Most importantly, epigraphers and linguists are now collaborating across the old boundaries of Egyptology, Assyriology, and classics, comparing how different empires used similar diplomatic language. They are listening, finally, to a conversation that spanned the entire ancient world, one where every word was chosen with immense care and consequence. The eastern Mediterranean coastline at the end of the Bronze Age paints a picture of utter chaos. From the ashes of great palaces in Greece to the smoldering ruins of cities in Anatolia and the Levant, a single, shadowy culprit has long been assigned the blame, a faceless force known only as the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian reliefs show them in pitched naval battles, their identities a confusing jumble of names like the Peliset and the Shekelesh. For over a century, the story was clear. A mysterious coalition of maritime raiders swept in from the unknown, a storm of foreign aggression that shattered the ancient world. But what if those invaders were not strangers at all? A newly translated Hittite inscription is forcing a complete rewrite of this apocalyptic tale. This text comes from the final, fading days of the Hittite Empire, attributed to its last known king, Suppiluliuma II. Earlier translations described a grim, definitive clash, a last stand against these seaborne enemies. The language seemed to confirm the old narrative, a desperate empire fighting for its life against an external threat. But modern linguists, armed with a better understanding of Hittite diplomatic terminology and the symbolic logograms used in their writing, have performed a subtle but seismic reinterpretation. The words once read as battle against the Sea Peoples now carry a far more complex meaning. The key shift is in understanding who these peoples actually were. The new analysis suggests the inscription does not describe a monolithic foreign horde arriving from across the sea. Instead, it points to a tangled network of groups already operating within and around the Hittite sphere of influence. These were displaced communities fleeing hardship elsewhere, opportunistic mercenary bands for hire, and rival Anatolian powers seizing a moment of imperial weakness. The Hittite state wasn't simply attacked, it unraveled from within and from the edges, pulled apart by forces it had once managed, traded with, or even employed. This reframes the entire collapse from a sudden, violent invasion to a protracted, messy process of regional realignment, where the lines between insider and outsider, ally and enemy, became hopelessly blurred. Imagine a great tree not struck down by a single lightning bolt, but slowly consumed by a combination of internal rot, drought, and opportunistic vines. The new translation paints the Sea Peoples not as the lightning bolt, but as the vines and the drought, symptoms and accelerants of a system already under profound stress. This forces historians to shift their gaze from the coastline to the heartland, to questions of climate shifts, trade network failures, and internal political frailty. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse deepens, becoming less about a villain and more about a perfect storm, a lesson in how fragile even the mightiest empires can be when multiple pressures converge. This shift from external invaders to internal collapse is a profound lesson in reading between the lines. But what happens when the lines themselves are a deliberate performance? To find out, we must travel east from the crumbling Hittite world to the zenith of another empire, one whose voice was deliberately engineered to echo with pure dread. The heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, centered in what is now northern Iraq, was a masterpiece of organized power. Its kings left behind sprawling palace complexes and, most famously, vast libraries of clay tablets and monumental wall carvings that chronicled their reigns. For generations, historians have listened to these accounts and heard the voice of unvarnished, psychopathic brutality. The annals of kings like Ashurnasirpal II are filled with passages that are difficult to read even today. They meticulously list cities razed to the ground, forests of impaled victims, and leaders flayed alive with their skin then draped over city walls. The language is visceral, the imagery unrelenting. It created the enduring image of Assyria as history's first true empire of terror, an unstoppable machine that ruled solely through the promise of unimaginable cruelty. But a new wave of epigraphers and linguists are pressing pause on that assumption. They are asking a critical question: what if these texts are not a straightforward diary of events, but a highly polished strategic broadcast? By analyzing the grammar and structure of these inscriptions with modern tools, scholars are noticing something startling. The most gruesome descriptions are not random outbursts of violence. They follow a strict, repetitive formula. They appear most frequently in texts intended for public display, like the foundation stones of new palaces or the monuments erected in conquered cities. The verbs of destruction are often paired with subtle qualifying clauses about the restoration of order, the imposition of fair taxes, and the benevolent rule of the Assyrian king. This pattern suggests the extreme violence was a calculated rhetorical device, a propaganda of fear designed for multiple audiences. For rival kingdoms hearing these stories through traders and diplomats, the message was a simple deterrent: do not resist. For the Assyrian elite and the populations of newly conquered lands, the message was about the absolute, divine-backed power of the king to both destroy and to rebuild. The reality of daily governance, as seen in thousands of administrative tablets recording grain shipments, labor assignments, and legal disputes, was far more mundane and bureaucratic. The empire likely relied more on a sophisticated system of provincial administration, incentives for trade, and the strategic deportation of skilled artisans and farmers to new regions to stabilize its territory. This does not erase the real suffering that occurred, but it reframes it. The hyperbolic boasts of violence were the sharp, terrifying edge of a much broader and more complex system of control. It challenges the cartoonish image of Assyria as a murderous regime, revealing it instead as a pioneering state that mastered one of history's most enduring tools, the use of narrative itself to project power and manage an empire. The king was not just a warrior, he was a storyteller, and his most terrifying tales were carefully crafted to ensure they were the only ones anyone would dare to tell. Yet understanding these royal proclamations requires more than a simple dictionary. Think of a modern detective handed a cold case file from a century ago, filled with coded slang and cultural references that have been lost to time. The new breakthroughs in translating these ancient texts work in a similar way, employing a sophisticated forensic toolbox to read not just the words, but the world behind them. One of the most powerful tools is the analysis of parallel texts. Imagine finding the same treaty or diplomatic letter copied in the archives of two rival empires like Egypt and the Hittites. By comparing the subtle differences in wording, how each side describes the same event or relationship, translators can decode the diplomatic spin and uncover the shared, unspoken rules of ancient statecraft. Another clue lies in the mistakes. Scribes were human, and their occasional errors, a misplaced sign or a corrected word, are invaluable. They reveal which phrases were so routine they were written on autopilot, and which were unusual enough to cause a stumble, hinting at new ideas or foreign concepts entering the language. Paleography, the study of how written signs evolved over centuries, acts as a dating mechanism. The shape of a single wedge in a cuneiform sign or the curve of a hieroglyph can pin an inscription to a specific ruler's reign, ensuring we connect the words to the correct historical moment. Perhaps most crucially, translators now insist on marrying the text with its archaeological context. Where was the stone found? Was it displayed prominently in a public plaza or buried secretly in a temple foundation? Was it found alongside everyday pottery or precious offerings? This context tells us the intended audience, whether it was a boast for the masses or a sacred covenant with the gods. As one leading epigrapher notes, the goal is no longer just to translate the vocabulary, but to read between the lines for the cultural concepts that have no direct modern equivalent, ideas of divine kingship, honor, or cosmic order that shaped every sentence. This multi-layered approach transforms translation from a linguistic exercise into a form of cultural archaeology, giving us the tools to hear the true nuance in a king's voice, to distinguish between a factual report and a masterful piece of political theater. But if the Assyrian kings used stories to project power, what about the very first storytellers of civilization? Deep in the dusty archives of ancient Mesopotamia, a single clay tablet offers a puzzle that challenges our most basic assumptions about history itself. Known as the Sumerian king list, it begins not with a battle or a treaty, but with a breathtaking declaration: kingship descended from the heavens. It then proceeds to name rulers and their cities, but the numbers attached to them are not of this world. The first kings are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. As the list progresses, the reigns grow shorter, eventually settling into the lifespans of mortal men we can recognize from archaeology. For a long time, this text was seen as a frustrating mix of wild myth and shaky fact, a flawed historical record from a primitive time. The new revelation, however, is that calling it a history book misses the point entirely. Modern scholars now see the king list not as failed science, but as brilliant political theology. It was likely composed in the city of Isin around 4,000 years ago, a time of intense rivalry between Mesopotamian city-states. The scribes of Isin were not trying to document the past as it happened. They were constructing a past that served the present, by creating a single, unbroken lineage of kingship that stretched from the gods through mythical super-kings and directly down to the current ruler of Isin. They were making an argument. They were saying kingship is a divine institution. It has always existed, and it now resides here with us. The impossibly long reigns at the beginning establish a sacred, golden age, a time when gods walked closer to earth. The gradual shortening of reigns mirrors a theological concept of the world slowly moving away from that divine perfection. By the time the list reaches historical figures, the authority of kingship has been firmly established as a timeless principle, legitimizing whoever held the throne last. This transforms the king list from a bad history text into a masterwork of ideological engineering. It shows us that for the Sumerians, the purpose of recording the past was not primarily about factual accuracy in our modern sense. It was about meaning, order, and legitimacy. The past was a tool to explain the present and secure the future. This changes how we view every other ancient chronicle. It asks us to listen not just for what they say happened, but for why they needed that story to be true. The real mystery isn't the length of those early reigns, but the sheer power of a narrative to shape reality for thousands of years. The power of narrative to shape reality finds its ultimate expression not on a fragile clay tablet, but on the face of a mountain, carved over 300 feet high on a sheer limestone cliff along an ancient highway in modern Iran. The Behistun inscription is a monumental declaration of truth, or at least one king's version of it. Commissioned by Darius the Great of the Achaemenid Empire around 500 years before the Common Era, this colossal relief shows the king triumphing over his rivals, with the winged symbol of divine favor hovering above him. For over 2 millennia, its message was a silent mystery to the travelers who passed beneath it, an epic story written in 3 different scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. In the 19th century, this trilingual text became the key that finally unlocked the cuneiform writing system, earning its reputation as the Rosetta Stone of Mesopotamia. The initial triumph was simply reading it, but the real revelation is happening now as scholars compare what the 3 versions actually say. They are discovering that Darius's story was not simply copied word for word across languages. The differences are subtle but profound. In the Old Persian version, meant for the Persian heartland, Darius emphasizes his direct lineage from the founding king Achaemenes, framing his rule as a righteous restoration of a pure Persian royal line. The tone is one of familiar, almost familial authority. The Elamite version, intended for an ancient and influential culture within the empire, adjusts the emphasis. It spends more time detailing the administrative reorganization of the empire, speaking to a population long accustomed to bureaucratic sophistication. The Babylonian version, aimed at the culturally proud and ancient cities of Mesopotamia, takes a different tack. It leans heavily into the concept of divine selection, connecting Darius's legitimacy to the Babylonian god Marduk, and carefully framing his actions as those of a traditional Mesopotamian king restoring order from chaos. These are not translation errors, they are evidence of a brilliantly sophisticated propaganda campaign. Darius and his scribes understood that a one-size-fits-all message would not hold together a vast, multicultural realm stretching from the Indus Valley to the Balkans. Each version was a tailored performance designed to resonate with the specific historical memories, cultural values, and political anxieties of its primary audience. For the Persians, he was the noble heir; for the Elamites, the competent administrator; for the Babylonians, the divinely chosen king. This transforms the Behistun cliff from a simple billboard of victory into a masterclass in early statecraft. It reveals an empire thinking strategically about narrative, using multilingualism not just for communication but for consolidation. Darius was broadcasting a single story of legitimacy, but he was smart enough to tell it in 3 distinct dialects of power. The sheer cliff face of Behistun shows an empire speaking in multiple voices to secure its power. But what about a civilization that built its authority not on words carved for travelers to see, but on spells whispered in eternal darkness? For the Old Kingdom Egyptians, the ultimate expression of power was the pyramid, a silent, geometric mountain pointing to the heavens. These monuments have long been seen as the ultimate symbol of a pharaoh's solitary divinity, a god-king's personal staircase to join the eternal stars. The sacred texts lining their burial chambers, known as the pyramid texts, seem to confirm this. For over a century, translations of these spells painted a picture of a lonely, perilous journey. The pharaoh fought off demons, navigated celestial waterways, and pleaded with gods to recognize him as one of their own. It was the story of one individual's triumphant escape from mortality. But a quiet revolution in translating these very texts is dismantling that solitary image. The breakthrough lies in the minutiae of the ancient Egyptian language, in tiny grammatical markers known as determinatives and the precise forms of verbs. Earlier translators, working with a more literal understanding, read many spells as first-person narratives. I ascend, I take my place. New analyses suggest a more nuanced voice. Many of these utterances were likely not declarations from the pharaoh himself, but ritual speeches performed for him by priests. The verbs shift from I to he, and the determinatives, those small signs that classify a word, indicate these are spells of activation and protection, not just autobiography. This changes everything. The journey was not a solo mission. It was a communal, state-sponsored ritual, the entire religious apparatus of Egypt working to successfully launch their king into the cosmos. Why was this so urgent? Because the pharaoh was not just a god, he was a crucial linchpin in a system called Mat, the fundamental order of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. His successful rebirth and ascension were not for his benefit alone. They were the essential service he performed for the entire kingdom. By joining the eternal circuit of the sun god Ra, the pharaoh renewed the contract between the divine and the mortal world. He ensured the Nile would flood, the harvests would grow, and chaos would be held at bay. His power, then, is reinterpreted. He was less a remote tyrant hoarding divinity and more a vital conduit, the central figure in a shared cosmological project that required the participation of thousands, from the high priest to the farmer. The pyramid was not a monument to one man's ego, but the engine room of a national covenant, a machine built by the many to ensure the stability of all. This new reading softens the harsh edges of absolute monarchy, revealing a profound ideological bargain. The people gave labor, allegiance, and resources to support the pharaoh's divine work, and in return, he maintained the very order of the universe that allowed their society to exist. It reframes the old kingdom from a dictatorship of one to a civilization bound together by a common, sacred purpose, where the king's ultimate power was his ultimate responsibility. A single corrected data point can collapse an entire scientific model, revealing hidden connections and forcing a complete recalibration. This is the ripple effect now moving through the study of the ancient world, where one new translation does not simply rewrite a single chapter, but sends shockwaves across the entire historical landscape. Take that pivotal reinterpretation of the Hittite texts concerning the Sea Peoples. It was not an isolated correction for a failing empire's final days. That single shift in understanding creates a cascade of questions that reach far beyond Anatolia. Suddenly, the famous inscriptions of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III, which celebrate his great naval victory over these same sea peoples, must be re-examined. Were the Egyptians truly fighting off a unified foreign invasion, or were they confronting a chaotic wave of displaced peoples and opportunistic groups spilling over from the collapsed Hittite sphere? This changes the nature of Ramesses' triumph from a defense against an existential threat to a complex border control operation with profound political spin. The archaeology of the Canaanite coast, where new cultural artifacts and settlement patterns appear around this same time, must also be reinterpreted. Are these the marks of a violent conquest by invaders, or the gradual integration of refugee communities seeking new homes? Even the biblical Philistines, long linked to the Sea Peoples narrative, find their origin story opened up for new debate, moving from a simple tale of arrival to a more nuanced process of cultural formation. This is how one grammatical clue in a Hittite inscription can alter the story of three different civilizations simultaneously. The ripple effect works just as powerfully with the reassessment of Assyrian propaganda. When historians stop taking the boasts of flaying and impalement at face value and recognize them as calculated performance, it forces a parallel reassessment in other fields. Economists and sociologists who study ancient empires must now revisit their models of how the Neo-Assyrian state actually functioned. If sheer terror was not the primary engine of control, then how did they manage resource extraction from their provinces so effectively? The answer likely lies in those thousands of mundane administrative tablets, pointing to sophisticated systems of taxation, incentives for regional elites, and the strategic relocation of populations to boost agricultural output and dilute local resistance. This transforms our view of imperial power from a blunt instrument to a complex, bureaucratic machine that used narrative fear as just one tool among many. The profound implication is clear. Ancient history is not a collection of isolated stories, but a single, interconnected web. Tug on one thread of translation, and the entire tapestry shimmers and changes its pattern. A new understanding of a Hittite verb recalibrates Egyptian monuments, Canaanite pottery, and economic theories alike. This scholarly work is not just about finding the right words, it is about listening to the echoes those words create across centuries and continents, and understanding that when the past changes its story in one place, it is speaking to us everywhere. While the ripple effect of one word can reshape empires, sometimes an entire library emerges from the earth to rewrite a continent's earliest chapters. In the 1970s, at a site in northern Syria known as Tel Marduk, archaeologists uncovered a discovery that stunned the scholarly world: the royal palace archive of the ancient city of Ebla. Buried under the debris of its final destruction around 4,000 years ago, they found not just a few tablets, but thousands upon thousands of them, an entire state's paperwork frozen in time. The initial excitement was about their very existence, proving Ebla was a major kingdom of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. But the real revolution has been a slow, meticulous process of translation that continues to this day, revealing a world far more connected and sophisticated than anyone dared to imagine. These are not epic poems or royal boasts. They are the day-to-day documents of a functioning state, inventories of textiles and metals, records of court verdicts, and meticulous logs of diplomatic exchanges. And it is in this bureaucratic minutiae that a staggering new picture is coming into focus. Ebla was not a lonely outpost. The tablets document a dizzying web of connections. They mention the receipt of lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, cedar wood from the Levantine coast, and silver from Anatolia. They list gifts sent to and received from powerful contemporaries like the Kingdom of Mari on the Euphrates. But more than just listing goods, the language itself is revelatory. The scribes of Ebla used precise, formal terminology for treaties, for the status of emissaries, and for the ceremonial exchange of gifts. This vocabulary shows that these were not haphazard trades between neighbors. but the operations of a highly formalized international system, a kind of Bronze Age diplomatic protocol observed by multiple kingdoms. This forces a monumental shift in our timeline. Historians long believed such complex, rule-based interstate relations were a later development, perhaps perfected by the great empires of the second millennium like the Hittites and Egyptians. Ebler's archives from 1,000 years earlier prove that this system of diplomacy, with its shared language of obligation and respect, was already mature and widespread. The city emerges from the clay not as a solitary city-state, but as a central hub in a vast, previously unrecognized network, a diplomatic and commercial internet that spanned the Near East. This rewrites the early history of the entire region, elevating Ebla from a footnote to a foundational power, a place where the very rules of how kingdoms talked to one another were being etched into wet clay, setting a precedent that would echo for millennia. Yet this process of reinterpretation is anything but a quiet consensus. The field of ancient translation is less a dusty library and more a vibrant, sometimes heated courtroom, where every newly proposed meaning must stand before a jury of peers and face rigorous cross-examination. The evidence is a fragment of clay, the witnesses are long gone, and the verdict can reshape our understanding of human society itself. Consider the simple Sumerian word lugul. For generations, textbooks translated it straightforwardly as king, conjuring images of a centralized hierarchical state with a single ruler at its pinnacle. This single translation built a model of early Mesopotamia as a land of monarchies from its very dawn. But a growing faction of scholars now argues this is a classic case of a modern concept being projected onto the ancient past. They point out that in the earliest texts, the term lugul appears alongside other titles like insi, often translated as governor or steward. The context suggests a lugul might not have been a permanent, all-powerful sovereign, but rather a temporary leader, a big man or warlord elevated during times of crisis, perhaps for a specific military campaign. His authority could have been situational, negotiated among a council of elders or other powerful families. If this interpretation holds, it forces a dramatic rewrite of early state formation. Instead of kingdoms emerging fully formed, we might be seeing a long, messy period of experimentation with power, where leadership was fluid and communal structures remained strong. The debate over lugul is not about dictionary definitions, it is about the very architecture of the first cities. Was power inherited by one or earned by the many? Each translation argues for a different origin story of civilization itself. Similar battles rage over the interpretation of legal codes. The Hittite laws, inscribed on clay tablets in the second millennium before the Common Era, contain passages dealing with personal status and family life. One scholar, examining the terminology and penalties, might argue a particular statute shows a degree of legal protection for certain individuals within a bonded system, suggesting a complex social hierarchy with defined rights. Another, looking at the same text, might emphasize the overwhelming power dynamics and the language of property, arguing the translation reveals a far more rigid institution. These are not mere academic squabbles, they are fundamental disagreements about the texture of daily life in the ancient world, about how societies defined personhood, obligation, and justice. As one epigrapher notes, we are constantly negotiating between the words on the clay and our own cultural frameworks. Another counters that the thrill of the work is precisely in those moments of dissonance, where the ancient text refuses to conform to our expectations and demands we see the past on its own terms. This dynamic clash of interpretations is not a weakness of the field, it is its greatest strength. It is a powerful immune system against dogmatism, ensuring that our view of the past remains fluid, questioned, and alive. Every contested translation is a reminder that history is not a set of facts we uncover, but a continuous conversation we have with the echoes of those who came before, a conversation where the meaning of a single word can still change the story of us all. The Courtroom of Translation faces its greatest silent witness in the Aegean Sea. On the island of Crete, the grand palaces of the Minoan civilization stand as breathtaking monuments to a sophisticated, artistic, and seemingly peaceful power that flourished for centuries. Their walls are covered in beautiful, swirling frescoes of dolphins and acrobats, but they are utterly mute, for alongside this art, the Minoans left behind thousands of clay tablets inscribed with a script we call Linear A. Unlike the royal proclamations of Assyria or the diplomatic letters of Ebla, these texts remain stubbornly undeciphered, the ultimate frontier in the quest to hear the ancient world speak. They are not epic poems carved in stone, but administrative records, lists of goods, and likely religious offerings, etched in a language that has been lost for over 3,000 years. This is not a case of mistranslation, but of complete silence, a civilization speaking to us in a code we have yet to crack. For decades, the dominant theory held that Linear A, like the later Mycenaean Greek script Linear B, which was deciphered in the 1950s, recorded an early Indo-European language. This fit a neat narrative of cultural succession, but the new wave of analysis is challenging that assumption with powerful computational tools. Researchers are now feeding the known linear assigns and their sequences into sophisticated algorithms that analyze statistical patterns, sign frequencies, and positional grammar. While a full translation remains elusive, these digital approaches are suggesting a startling new possibility. The language of the Minoans may not belong to the Indo-European family at all. The structural patterns emerging from the data show little clear kinship with early Greek or other known Indo-European tongues. Instead, some linguists now speculate it could be a relic of a much older, pre-Greek linguistic layer of the Mediterranean, perhaps related to languages once spoken in Anatolia or even further east. This single suggestion, born from probability and pattern recognition, has seismic implications. If true, it means the foundational culture of the European Bronze Age, the source of the myths of the labyrinth and the Minotaur that so fascinated later Greeks, was linguistically and ethnically distinct from the peoples who would eventually conquer them. The Minoans were not early Greeks, they were something else entirely, a separate branch on the human tree whose voice we have never heard. Beyond family ties, the cold logic of statistics is warming up our understanding of Minoan society itself. By analyzing how often certain signs appear together, and in what order, scholars can make educated guesses about the content of the tablets. Clusters of signs that consistently appear before numerals are likely commodity names, perhaps olive oil, wine, or textiles, painting a picture of a complex palace economy managing vast resources. Other recurring sign groups, often found on tablets within temple complexes, are hypothesized to be the names of deities or ritual offerings, giving us a shadowy outline of their religious world. Even without knowing the exact words, we can see the bureaucratic rhythm of their state, the meticulous record-keeping of a maritime power that dominated trade across the eastern Mediterranean. The enduring power of the linear enigma is a profound reminder of what we do not know. It humbles the entire historical project. The potential full translation of this script is the single greatest key still waiting to be turned in Bronze Age studies. It could radically reshape everything we think we understand about pre-Mycenaean power structures, revealing whether the Minoan thalassocracy was ruled by priest-kings, merchant princes, or a council of matriarchs. It could detail their trade networks with Egypt and the Levant from their own perspective, not from foreign records. Most importantly, it could finally clarify their true influence on the later Greek civilization that absorbed their myths and artistic motifs. Were the Greeks inheriting a legacy or overwriting one? The silent tablets of Crete hold the answer, a lost world waiting for its story to be told in its own words. a reminder that some of history's most important chapters are written in a language we are still learning to read. The silent tablets of Crete remind us that history's voice can be utterly lost, but when a text is found and a translation is made, the conversation is only just beginning. The true power of this new era of understanding lies not in any single discipline, but in the dynamic, sometimes contentious, dialogue between them. Imagine an archaeological team carefully brushing dust from the floor of a grand, columned hall adjacent to a king's monument. The monument's inscription, translated decades ago, clearly labels the structure as a treasury, a secure storehouse for the kingdom's wealth. This made perfect sense until the team's trowels began to uncover the artifacts left behind. Instead of stacks of coin molds or strongboxes, they find delicate ceramic vessels perfectly suited for pouring libations, small altars blackened by soot, and carefully arranged deposits of animal bones showing signs of ceremonial feasting. The material evidence whispers of ritual, not finance. Puzzled, the archaeologists turn to the linguists, holding up the physical puzzle pieces against the old translation. The linguists, in turn, go back to the original inscription. They focus on that key word, treasury. In the original cuneiform or hieroglyphic, it is a compound sign, a symbol made of other symbols. Earlier scholars, working with a limited set of parallel texts, interpreted it through the lens of economic administration. But now, prompted by the ritual artifacts, the linguists look again. They cross-reference the sign's components against a vast digital database of religious texts. They notice one component, a small, easily overlooked mark that often denotes a divine gift or an allotted portion. A new possibility emerges. The word might not mean a vault for hoarding, but a house of the divine allotment, a place where the god's bounty, perhaps grain, oil, or precious metals, was ceremonially distributed to the people or to temple officials. This is not a minor tweak. It fundamentally reinterprets the king's role and the building's function. He is no longer just a wealthy ruler safeguarding his riches. He is a pivotal religious figure, the mediator who receives divine abundance and redistributes it according to sacred order. The building transforms from a locked warehouse into a vibrant, communal hub of ritual and social bonding, where the economy is inseparable from spirituality. This is the powerful synergy in action, the spade and the dictionary in constant conversation. The artifacts challenged the text was re-examined, and the new translation then recontextualized every artifact found within those walls. It is a virtuous cycle of discovery, where archaeology provides the tangible context that asks better questions of the language, and linguistics provides the nuanced meaning that makes sense of the scattered stones. One field asks, "What is this object?" The other asks, "What did they call it, and why?" Together, they begin to answer the only question that truly matters: what did it mean? A language can vanish, but its echo can be repurposed as a crown. In the rolling hills of southern Turkey, near the modern village of Karat, stands a set of monumental gateways from the late 8th century before the Common Era. They are the legacy of a local ruler named Azatewada, who governed a small, fortified kingdom in the chaotic aftermath of the Great Bronze Age collapses. The gates are inscribed with his proclamation, but it is told twice in two different languages and scripts side by side. On one side, the text is in Phoenician, written in the alphabetic script used by the famed maritime traders of the Levant. On the other, it is in Luwian, written in the intricate hieroglyphic script once used across the Hittite Empire. For decades, this Karat bilingual was celebrated for a singular achievement. It was the Rosetta Stone that finally allowed scholars to decipher the long, mysterious Luwian hieroglyphs. The triumph was in the decoding itself, but now, with the language unlocked, historians are listening more carefully to what Azatewada is actually saying in each version, and they are hearing a masterclass in political positioning tailored for two very different audiences. The Luwian version, aimed at the local population and the regional elite of the Anatolian hinterlands, is a breathtaking piece of ideological salvage. As Atawada reaches back into the dusty attic of history and pulls out the grandest costume he can find, he adopts the lofty, formal titles of the Hittite great kings, an empire that had fallen centuries before. He speaks of bringing peace and justice to the land in the same formulaic rhetoric used by those imperial predecessors. He is, in effect, wrapping himself in the faded but still resonant banner of the Hittites, presenting himself not as a minor warlord in a fractured landscape, but as the legitimate heir to a glorious, ordered past. For his people, this was a powerful narrative. It offered stability, continuity, and a sense of restored pride in a world that had known little but disruption. Yet turn to the Phoenician version on the same stone, and the tone subtly shifts. While the core message of his achievements remains, the grandiose imperial titles are softened. The emphasis leans more toward his role in establishing safety and prosperity for trade, in building a fortified harbor, and in fostering good relations with his neighbors. This was the version for the maritime network, for the Phoenician merchants whose ships were the lifeblood of the regional economy. To them, he presented himself as a reliable and capable partner, a guarantor of safe passage and profitable exchange, not just a king replaying ancient glories. This single monument, therefore, is not one message but two parallel performances. As Atawada was practicing a kind of geopolitical code switching to the inland, he invoked the memory of empire to command loyalty. To the coast, he projected the image of a pragmatic node in a commercial web to ensure wealth. This reveals a profound process in the wake of collapse. The power vacuum left by a fallen giant does not just fill with new armies. It fills with new stories. Local rulers become curators of the past, selectively resurrecting and repurposing the symbols, titles, and language of the old regime to manufacture legitimacy for their new and fragile states. They are not reviving an empire, they are scavenging its most potent imagery to build their own throne. The Carrot inscriptions show us that the most valuable thing a fallen empire leaves behind is often not its territory or its treasure, but its narrative, a story of power that others are desperate to retell as their own. These grand narratives of divine kings and diplomatic codes were not etched by the gods themselves, but by human hands holding a stylus. Behind every line of cuneiform wedged into damp clay, every hieroglyph carefully painted on a tomb wall, stood an individual scribe. These were the ancient world's technicians of memory, highly trained but ultimately human. And now, by zooming in with the meticulous eye of a discipline called paleography, scholars are learning to recognize their unique fingerprints in the very shape of the letters they left behind. A master scribe carving a royal inscription on stone would develop a distinctive style, a personal signature in the way he angled a wedge or proportioned a sign. Paleographers can sometimes trace this individual hand across multiple monuments, even those commissioned by different kings decades apart, revealing the career of a single, sought-after artisan whose skill was trusted with the most important messages of state. His personality might peek through in a consistent, elegant variant of a common sign, a subtle flourish that became his trademark. More tellingly, he might have a habitual slip, a spelling quirk, or a grammatical shortcut he used when working quickly. These are not mistakes that change meaning, but they are humanizing glimpses behind the curtain of official propaganda. They remind us that the voice of the king was filtered through the trained hand and sometimes the tired wrist of a real person. This becomes even more revealing when we see how these texts were copied and altered over time. It was common practice for a new king, especially one seeking legitimacy, to commission inscriptions that closely mirrored those of a powerful predecessor. On the surface, they appear to be simple copies, reaffirming the eternal glory of the royal line. But a paleographer comparing the two line by line can spot the tiny, politically charged edits. A later scribe might quietly omit a reference to a god who had fallen out of favor, or subtly amplify a title to make his current patron seem even greater than the past king. He might replace the name of a conquered city with a more recent victory, updating the resume for a new audience. These are not errors, they are deliberate, strategic revisions. They show history being carefully curated in real time, the past edited to better serve the present. The text becomes a living document, its very letters bearing witness to the shifting winds of political necessity. Suddenly, that imposing wall of carved propaganda feels less like a solid monolith and more like a parchment that has been palimpsested, written over, with the faint traces of the old story still visible beneath the new. This perspective fundamentally changes how we listen to these ancient voices. It personalizes the sources, pulling us from the abstract sweep of empires down to the quiet scriptorium, or the sun-drenched worksite where the monument was being raised. We are no longer hearing a disembodied divine proclamation, but a collaborative act of creation shaped by the skill of the artisan, the agenda of the patron, and the occasional human lapse. That consistent spelling quirk across 3 reigns tells a story of a valued craftsman. A cluster of hastily carved, less elegant signs on the bottom of a stela might hint at a deadline looming as the dedication ceremony approached. These texts were not intended as immutable truth, but as a crafted performance for a specific moment, created by fallible individuals who left their own subtle marks upon history. To recognize the scribe's hand is to remember that every version of the past comes to us through someone, a reminder that makes these stone and clay voices feel astonishingly, relatably human. Across the ocean, in the dense rainforests of Central America, a parallel revolution in stone was unfolding. For generations, the Maya were portrayed as the peaceful philosophers of the ancient world, a civilization of gentle astronomer priests who charted the stars and built elegant pyramids, seemingly disconnected from the brutal power politics of Eurasia. This serene image began to crumble in the late 20th century, not from a new archaeological dig, but from a linguistic breakthrough that finally gave voice to the thousands of intricate glyphs covering their monuments. The decipherment of the Mayan script, one of the most significant intellectual achievements of modern archaeology, ripped away that tranquil facade. Suddenly, the silent stelae and temple panels in great cities like Tikal and Palenque began to speak, and their stories were startlingly familiar. They narrated tales of relentless warfare, elaborate dynastic schemes, and the sacred duty of kings to capture rival nobles for ritual purposes. The texts revealed the precise names of rulers like the great Tikal king Jasor Chan Kawil, and they chronicled his military triumphs with a specificity that echoed Assyrian annals. A single stela might record not just a victory, but the exact date it occurred within the Maya's incredibly complex calendar, the name of the defeated lord, and the ritual that followed. This was not the record of a society apart. It was a classic playbook of royal propaganda, etched in limestone instead of clay. The Maya elite were divine kings, or Kuhul Ajor, holy lords who claimed to mediate between the human world and the gods. Their warfare was not random violence, but a sacred necessity to secure captives for ceremonies that renewed cosmic order and demonstrated the king's divine power. The discovery of texts detailing alliances and betrayals between cities like Calakmul and Tikal showed a landscape of shifting political blocs and intense rivalry, a network of competitive, militaristic city-states that mirrored the dynamics of ancient Mesopotamia or Greece. The revelation was profound. It demonstrated that the drive to use writing as a tool of legitimacy, to immortalize one's name and deeds in a divine narrative, was not a peculiar invention of the old world. It was a fundamental strategy of power, a human solution to the problem of rule that emerged independently across the globe. When a Maya scribe carefully carved a glyph proclaiming his king's descent from a founding deity, he was engaging in the same foundational act as a Sumerian scribe listing kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. They were both building a past to justify the present, using the permanence of the written word to anchor their king's authority in the eternal. The dense jungles of Guatemala and the arid plains of Iraq were worlds apart, but the stories their leaders told about themselves were born from the same deep human need to be remembered and to control the narrative of why they deserved to be. The silent hands of ancient scribes are now being illuminated by the cold light of modern screens. This new wave of translation is not driven by a single brilliant mind in an isolated library, but by a profound technological leap that has democratized and supercharged the entire field. At the heart of this revolution is something remarkably simple: access. Online portals like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative have digitized and cataloged hundreds of thousands of clay tablet fragments, placing high-resolution photographs and meticulous data just a click away for anyone with an internet connection. A scholar in Berlin can now inspect the fine details of a tablet stored in a museum in Chicago in the morning, and by the afternoon, collaborate with a linguist in Tokyo to discuss a peculiar sign sequence. This global, instantaneous network has shattered the old barriers of geography and institutional ownership, turning what was once a solitary pursuit into a worldwide conversation. But what about the inscriptions that are too faded for even the best camera to capture? Here, another tool steps in, one that feels almost like magic. Reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, involves taking dozens of photographs of a single object, each with a light source positioned at a different angle. Specialized software then combines these images, allowing a researcher to digitally move a virtual light across the surface of a tablet or stone slab on their computer screen. This process can reveal the subtlest indentations, the ghost of a wedge mark nearly smoothed away by time, or the faint trace of a sign in a damaged portion. A line of text declared illegible a century ago can suddenly spring into sharp relief, its meaning unlocked not by a new dictionary, but by a new way of seeing. It is as if we have been given a lamp that can shine from any direction, exposing secrets the naked eye could never perceive. The potential extends even further into the realm of artificial intelligence. Researchers are beginning to train machine learning algorithms to recognize patterns at a scale and speed impossible for humans. One application is in the heartbreaking puzzle of broken tablets. Museums hold countless fragments, like pieces from 1 million different jigsaws scattered across the globe. Our eye can analyze the curvature of a break, the handwriting style, and the linguistic content to suggest which fragments might belong together, offering a digital assistant in the ultimate reconstruction project. Other projects are exploring how our eye might analyze vast corpora of text to suggest statistical probabilities for completing damaged lines or identifying previously unseen grammatical constructions, acting as a powerful collaborator that highlights possibilities for human experts to explore and verify. This is not about machines replacing scholars, but about amplifying their intuition and extending their reach. Together, these tools represent a fundamental shift. The work is no longer constrained by the physical limits of a single researcher's travel budget or eyesight. It is powered by shared data, enhanced vision, and computational analysis. This technological triad is what allows today's epigraphers to approach the ancient record with unprecedented scale and precision, comparing thousands of texts to spot a pattern, reading a single sign that changes a dynasty's story, and listening, finally, to a past that is ready to speak in a clearer voice than ever before. The digital light of modern technology illuminates countless texts, yet a single, fractured line of stone can still ignite a firestorm of debate that burns across centuries. In the rolling hills of northern Israel, a broken slab of basalt known as the Tel Dan Stele was uncovered in the 1990s, Written in Aramaic by a king of Damascus in the 9th century before the Common Era, it commemorates his victory over two rival kings. The translation of one particular line sent shockwaves far beyond academic circles, for it appeared to contain the phrase "House of David." If accurate, this would be the first and earliest mention of King David's dynasty found outside the pages of the Bible, a physical artifact seemingly confirming the historical roots of a foundational figure. For many, it felt like a definitive answer pulled from the earth itself. But in the world of epigraphy, definitive answers are often just the starting point for a deeper, more contentious conversation. The stele is damaged and the crucial phrase is carved right along a break in the stone. The debate among philologists now centers on the precise reading of those contested letters. The original translators saw a clear sequence spelling Beitdud, which they read as Beit David or House of David. Other scholars, examining the fracture lines and the spacing of the letters, have proposed alternative readings. Could it be a place name or a reference to a temple of a deity? The fragmentary nature of the text means we lack the full narrative context that would settle the question. Those who defend the House of David reading point to the grammatical structure and parallels in other royal inscriptions, where naming a defeated king's dynasty was a standard practice of humiliation and boasting. The king of Damascus was essentially saying, "I defeated the family of David." The implications are monumental. It would place the biblical David and his lineage firmly within the documented political landscape of the 9th century, transforming him from a possibly legendary figure into the founder of a verifiable royal house recognized by its enemies. This tiny cluster of letters sits at a powerful intersection of history, faith, and modern identity, showing how the interpretation of ancient texts is never a neutral act. It is a process weighed by the hopes and questions of the present. The ongoing, meticulous debate over the Tel Dan Stele is not a sign of failure, but a perfect example of the rigorous, collective scrutiny that defines the field. It demonstrates that the most impactful discoveries are not those that end discussion, but those that begin a richer, more nuanced conversation, where every stroke of the chisel is measured, every possible meaning is weighed, and the past is understood not as a simple fact, but as a story we continually learn to read with greater care. A single contested line on the Tel Dan Stele reveals a deeper truth, that the act of translation is never just a technical task, it is an act of power. For centuries, the voices of ancient civilizations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas were interpreted almost exclusively through the lens of Western academia, their stories filtered through foreign grammars and foreign assumptions. A scholar in London or Berlin would decipher a text from a site in modern Iraq or Egypt, and their translation would become the definitive history, often without meaningful input from the living communities connected to that land. This legacy raises an urgent ethical question: who truly owns the past? The implications are both cultural and political. When an external academic tradition defines the narrative of a civilization, it can subtly reinforce colonial frameworks, casting those societies as passive subjects of study rather than active agents of their own complex histories. A royal inscription might be translated solely as a record of conquest, while missing the cultural nuances of kinship, obligation, or spiritual duty that a local linguistic tradition could illuminate. The very terminology used, words like primitive or barbarian in older translations, shaped generations of understanding. Today, a powerful corrective is underway, a movement toward collaborative, decolonized interpretation. This means projects are increasingly co-led by international teams and scholars from the source countries. A linguist from Turkey brings a deep understanding of regional language evolution to a Hittite text. An epigrapher from Mexico offers insight into indigenous concepts of time and royalty that transform the reading of a Mayan glyph. This partnership enriches the work immeasurably, grounding translations in a living cultural context and catching nuances a purely external perspective might forever miss. As one scholar from the region notes, it is not just about reading our writing, it is about reclaiming our voice in the story of humanity. This shift is intertwined with broader issues of heritage and access. The physical artifacts, the very tablets and stelae that hold these inscriptions, have often been housed in museums thousands of miles from their places of origin. The growing movement for repatriation argues that these objects are not just universal property, but vital pieces of a nation's cultural memory and identity. Alongside this, the digital revolution offers a promising path forward, creating global archives where high-resolution scans of an inscription can be studied by anyone, anywhere, democratizing access to the raw materials of history. The goal is a more equitable archaeology where the right to interpret goes hand in hand with the right to steward. This ethical layer transforms our entire journey through these newly translated texts. It reminds us that every breakthrough is not just a discovery about the ancient world, but a statement about our own. The quest to hear the past clearly is also a quest to listen more humbly, to share authority, and to understand that the true meaning of an ancient king's words may only fully emerge when all who have a claim to his legacy have a seat at the translation table. The stark, terrifying boasts of Assyrian kings were designed to paralyze resistance with fear, but a very different imperial voice was being crafted just to the east, one that understood conquest was only the beginning. In the sun-baked ceremonial capital of Persepolis and the majestic rock-cut tombs of Naksh-e-Rustam, the inscriptions of the Achaemenid Persian kings speak in a startlingly different register. Gone are the graphic inventories of torture and piles of skulls. In their place, we hear a calm, deliberate refrain of peace, truth, and cosmic order. The very script they used tells part of this story. While they inherited the complex, centuries-old cuneiform systems of Mesopotamia, King Darius I commissioned something new, a simplified, elegant Old Persian script composed of just 36 phonetic signs. This was not merely a writing system, it was a communication strategy. It was far easier for imperial administrators across a vast realm to learn and use than the hundreds of signs required for Babylonian cuneiform. This was a script built for clarity and efficiency, for governing, not just for intimidating. The content of the messages, newly understood through precise translation, reinforces this vision. Across multiple monuments, the same core concept appears, the idea of arta. This ancient Persian term is often translated as truth or order, but it carries a deeper meaning of cosmic righteousness and harmony. Darius' famous inscription at Naksh-e-Rustam does not list his victories first. It begins with a declaration of his moral and divine legitimacy. "I am not a liar, I am not a wrongdoer," he proclaims, framing his rule as a force against chaos and falsehood. He presents himself as the protector of the weak against the strong, the restorer of justice. This is a profound contrast to the Assyrian model, where Assyrian kings broadcast their power to destroy. The Persian kings articulated their power to build and maintain. The translations reveal this was not empty propaganda, but the ideological backbone of an unprecedented administrative experiment. The empire's famous infrastructure, like the 2,500-kilometer Royal Road with its relay stations, was celebrated in these texts not just as a military asset, but as a conduit for prosperity and connection. Decrees emphasize the king's role in digging canals, planting orchards, and suppressing banditry. Perhaps most revealing are the administrative tablets from Persepolis, which detail payments in silver and wine to workers of many ethnicities, all performing specialized labor. They show a system that, while hierarchical, operated on a predictable, bureaucratic logic rather than capricious terror. This is where we see the mechanics of ancient soft power. The Persian imperial formula was not to erase local cultures but to manage them. Inscriptions like the Cyrus Cylinder, though a unique Babylonian document, reflect this policy, speaking of returning displaced peoples to their homelands and restoring their temples. By allowing a degree of local autonomy under the overarching umbrella of Persian authority and law, the empire reduced the need for constant, costly military suppression. Their power was projected not just through armies, but through a compelling narrative of benevolent, just, and orderly rule. This reframes the Persian Empire from a mere military superpower into history's first conscious, large-scale project in multicultural governance. It was an empire that thought deeply about communication, both in the simplicity of its script and the consistency of its message, building its legitimacy not on the fear it inspired, but on the peace it claimed to guarantee. The Persian vision of Ata reveals a fundamental truth about translation. Some ancient ideas simply have no direct counterpart in modern speech. This is the most profound frontier in the field, the untranslatable concept. For generations, scholars faced with these terms would reach for the closest approximation in English or French, a necessary shortcut that often flattened a rich, complex worldview into a single, misleading word. Take the Egyptian principle of Mat. It was often rendered simply as truth or order, but to an ancient Egyptian, Mat was far more. It was the cosmic harmony established at creation, the principle of justice in society, the truth in speech, and the balance in nature. It was both a goddess and an abstract force that the pharaoh was duty-bound to maintain through correct ritual and righteous rule. To call it just truth is like calling the ocean just water. It misses the immense, living system it represents. Similarly, the Mesopotamian term melamu was frequently translated as glory or splendor. This makes it sound like a simple metaphor for fame. In reality, melamu described a terrifying, awe-inspiring radiance that was believed to emanate from gods and from divinely appointed kings. It was a physical, almost weaponized aura of divine power that could strike enemies with panic and blindness. When an Assyrian king claimed his melamu covered the enemy land, he was not boasting about his reputation. He was describing a supernatural weapon in his arsenal, a conceptual force we have no single word for today. Then there is the Hittite administrative term parahandandata. Earlier dictionaries might list it as frontier governance, but new analyses reveal a more nuanced idea. It encompassed the entire philosophy of managing the edges of the empire, not through rigid control, but through a flexible system of delegated authority to local lords, strategic gift-giving to buffer chieftains, and a keen understanding of fluctuating loyalties. It was a sophisticated doctrine of indirect rule for an age without instant communication, a concept for which we need a full paragraph, not a single term. The struggle with these words forces a humbling realization. Earlier translations, by shoehorning these ideas into familiar boxes like glory or administration, accidentally made ancient people think more like us. The new approach, which uses lengthy descriptions and contextual explanations, accepts a startling fact: they did not. Their mental categories, their very perception of reality, could be fundamentally different. Our modern vocabulary, built on centuries of different philosophy, science, and politics, acts as a filter. We can describe the components of Mat or melamu, but we lack the cultural framework to feel them as an ancient Egyptian or Assyrian did. This linguistic boundary teaches us profound humility. It means that no matter how many inscriptions we decipher, a part of the ancient mind remains just out of reach, glimpsed through a conceptual veil. Our understanding of their empires, therefore, is always an approximation, a translation not just of language, but of consciousness itself. It invites us to listen more carefully, to sit with the ambiguity of a term that refuses to be pinned down, and to appreciate that the deepest mysteries of the past are not hidden in lost libraries, but in the silent spaces between our words and theirs. These conceptual barriers remind us that language shapes reality itself. But what if a civilization's entire reality was meticulously recorded in lists? On the Greek mainland and on Crete, in the ashes of palaces burned down over 3,000 years ago, archaeologists found thousands of small, unbaked clay tablets inscribed with a script called Linear B. The brilliant decipherment in the 1950s proved it recorded an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaeans, the legendary age of Agamemnon and Achilles. That breakthrough was monumental, but it was only the opening of a vault. The real story has unfolded slowly in the decades since, as scholars refine translations and cross-reference these fragmented records. They reveal a world far removed from the epic poetry of Homer. These are not tales of heroic rage or divine intervention. They are the dry, meticulous paperwork of a state bureaucracy, and they paint a picture of control so detailed it becomes almost dizzying. At the great palace of Pylos, a single tablet might not just record the existence of chariots. It will list them by their individual parts, one tablet noting the allocation of a single pair of wheels to a specific craftsman, another recording the issuance of bronze for axle fittings. At Knossos on Crete, tablets track vast flocks of sheep, often down to the exact number of animals under the care of individual shepherds, with careful notes on which are rams, ewes, or lambs. The palace monitored stores of olive oil, honey, and grains, not in vague terms, but in precise measured units. They even recorded specific quantities of spices like coriander, cumin, and saffron, precious commodities likely used in perfumes, medicines, or elite cuisine. This is an empire of the inventory, a kingdom run by accountants. The figure at the top of this pyramid was the Wanax, the Mycenaean king, but the translations show his power was not expressed primarily through epic conquests, at least in these records. His authority flowed through a sprawling, literate administration. Scribes in various departments recorded every incoming tribute, every outgoing ration, every tool issued from the palace workshops. They listed the names of hundreds of individuals, from high officials and priests to groups of female textile workers and their dependent children, detailing their grain allowances. This was a redistributive economy on a massive scale. Raw materials flowed into the palace centers, were transformed into goods in state-controlled workshops, and were then allocated back out to support the palace bureaucracy, the military, and religious festivals. The level of granular management suggests a state that sought to minimize uncertainty, to account for every resource in a potentially fragile environment. It forces a complete rethink of late Bronze Age Greece. This is not the world of fiercely independent, honor-driven warlords portrayed in later myth. It is a highly centralized, complex, and paper-heavy state system, a precursor to the intricate bureaucracies of later empires. The Mycenaeans, it turns out, were not just warriors waiting for their Trojan War. They were auditors, logisticians, and warehouse managers, building their power one meticulously recorded chariot wheel at a time. Yet for all the voices we have learned to hear, entire libraries remain mute. The future of this story lies not only in refining what we know, but in confronting the profound silences that still blanket the ancient world. The next great chapter in history is literally waiting to be read, locked inside scripts that have defied understanding for over 5,000 years. The greatest of these enigmas is the Proto-Elamite script found on clay tablets from ancient Iran. Dating to around 3,100 years before the Common Era, it is arguably the oldest undeciphered writing system on Earth, even older than the earliest cuneiform from neighboring Mesopotamia. Scholars can see it is a complex mix of numerical signs and pictorial symbols, likely used for administrative accounting, but the language it records is a complete mystery. Is it an isolate, a tongue with no known relatives, or could it hold the key to understanding the very first experiments with writing outside the fertile river valleys? Then there is the elegant, iconic script of the Indus Valley civilization, a society that flourished across modern Pakistan and northwest India. Its symbols appear on thousands of small stone seals, often alongside images of mythical beasts. Despite over a century of effort, the script refuses to yield. The texts are frustratingly short, and with no known bilingual inscription to act as a Rosetta Stone, the language of one of the world's first urban cultures remains a tantalizing secret. What were they recording? The names of merchants, invocations to deities? We simply do not know. Beyond these grand puzzles, there are vast troves of known texts still awaiting a full conversation. Across Turkey, new surveys are cataloging hundreds of Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions carved on cliffs and monuments, each one a potential piece in the puzzle of Anatolia's complex post-Hittite world. And in museum storerooms everywhere, boxes of fragmentary tablets sit in drawers, their broken lines considered too damaged to read. This is where the next technological leap promises revolution. Imagine applying advanced reflectance imaging or new artificial intelligence pattern recognition to these discarded fragments. AI trained on thousands of complete cuneiform texts could suggest probable word sequences for a broken line, offering a digital hypothesis for a human scholar to test. The ultimate dream, of course, is the discovery of a new major bilingual inscription, another Behistun or Rosetta Stone, perhaps lying buried beneath the sands of Egypt or within the foundations of a Mesopotamian temple, holding a familiar language alongside an unknown one. Such a find could crack a code overnight, instantly giving voice to a civilization we have only ever known through its silent artifacts. This is the thrilling, unfinished nature of the quest. The map of the ancient world is still dotted with blank spaces labeled "Here There Be Scripts." Every undeciphered symbol is a door to a lost realm of thought, to a king's name we have never spoken, to a god we have never named. The adventure is far from over. The next sentence that will force us to rethink an empire is already written, waiting in plain sight on a forgotten hillside or nestled in a tray of pottery shards, ready for the curious mind and the new tool that will finally grant it an audience. The old map of early empires, with its neat, isolated blocks labeled Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Hittites, is now obsolete. The newly translated voices from stone and clay demand a complete redrawing. What emerges is not a world of solitary giants shouting into the void, but a vibrant, humming network of intense interaction. This was a planet already deeply connected, where royal courts from the Nile to the Indus were engaged in a continuous, sophisticated conversation. They shared more than just luxury goods, they exchanged entire frameworks of power. A diplomatic term perfected in Ebla would find its echo in a Hittite treaty. The concept of divine radiance, melamu, traveled from Mesopotamia to influence how Anatolian kings presented themselves. The propaganda techniques of Assyrian terror and Persian benevolent order were not isolated inventions, but competing solutions to the same eternal problem: how to make people obey across vast distances. This constant ideological cross-pollination reveals these empires as participants in a shared workshop of statecraft, borrowing, adapting, and refining each other's best or most terrifying ideas. The brute force entity, the empire that rules solely through the sword, is largely a myth exposed by translation. In its place, we see a sophisticated, multi-tooled experiment. Power was projected through calculated narrative, whether etched on a cliff face or whispered in a burial chamber. It was administered through meticulous bureaucracy, tracking chariot wheels and jars of honey with obsessive detail. It was maintained through a flexible understanding of local cultures, allowing 1,000 different voices to speak, so long as they ultimately praised the king. Even their collapses appear more nuanced, not simple stories of barbarian invasion, but complex unravelings where climate stress, internal rebellion, and the movement of desperate peoples combined in a perfect storm. The early empire, therefore, redefines itself. It was humanity's first large-scale attempt to build something lasting in a diverse and unpredictable world. It was an experiment in scaling trust, identity, and communication long before the instant relay of information. The lessons etched into these ancient stones feel unexpectedly familiar. They speak to the enduring challenges of governing diverse populations, the power of a compelling story to unite or divide, and the delicate balance between projecting strength and fostering stability. In listening to their recalculated voices, we are not just hearing about the distant past. We are overhearing the first, tentative drafts of our own globalized world, a reminder that the most ancient problems of power and community are still being translated in real time today. The stone and clay broadcasts of ancient kings were the original social media feeds, a permanent record of spin designed for an audience of both subjects and the future. This ancient playbook for shaping reality feels unsettlingly familiar. When an Assyrian king carved hyper-violent boasts onto a public monument, he was not just recording events, he was conducting perception management, crafting a narrative of invincibility to deter rivals and control his own people. The Persian Emperor Darius, commissioning his story in 3 tailored scripts, was practicing strategic multilingual communication, ensuring his message of benevolent order resonated differently with the proud Babylonians, the bureaucratic Elamites, and his Persian homeland. These were not primitive acts, they were sophisticated, state-level campaigns to construct a specific version of truth. Today, we are surrounded by the same fundamental forces, just amplified by digital speed and global reach. Modern states and leaders still engage in elaborate image management, releasing carefully curated footage, employing strategic terminology during conflicts, and framing economic data within narratives of triumph or resilience. Political rallies, official statements, and even the architecture of government buildings are all part of a continuous performance of power and legitimacy, a direct echo of the stele and palace reliefs of antiquity. The medium has evolved from chisel and clay to satellite and screen, but the core objective remains identical: to control the story, to shape public belief, and to secure authority. Recognizing this deep history transforms how we consume information. Understanding that the royal inscriptions of Nineveh were propaganda, not impartial journalism, makes us more critical listeners to the official stories of our own time. It teaches us to ask the same questions of a modern press release that an epigrapher asks of a broken tablet. Who is the intended audience for this message? What action or belief does the sender hope to inspire? What alternative perspectives are being omitted or silenced? The study of these ancient texts becomes a masterclass in media literacy across millennia. It reveals the universal human drives that transcend technology, the need to legitimize power, to unify a population behind a common identity, and to project a legacy that will outlast a single lifetime. Every leader, ancient or modern, wants to write the first draft of history. The real power lies in realizing we are not just the audience for these narratives, we are also the scribes. Our engagement, our skepticism, and our own voices in the public square are part of the ongoing conversation that determines which stories endure and which are revised by the clear light of scrutiny. In learning to decode the crafted words of a long-dead emperor, we sharpen our ability to navigate the crafted words that shape our world today, hearing in them not just news, but the age-old echo of a king speaking to his kingdom. These silent witnesses are teaching us to listen differently. Our journey through these newly translated words reveals that history is not a static monument we visit, but a living conversation we join. Each corrected translation, every contested glyph, is a new voice entering that conversation, challenging the echoes we have listened to for generations. The empires of old, from the Sumerians to the Maya, are being rediscovered not as monolithic blocks of stone, but as dynamic networks of people, more complex, more deeply connected, and infinitely more human than we ever imagined. The scribe's quirk, the tailored message for a foreign audience, the bureaucratic list of chariot wheels, these details dissolve the cold marble of antiquity into something warm, familiar, and astonishingly intricate. As the tools of technology and the spirit of global collaboration continue to unlock these silent witnesses, we must cultivate a particular kind of courage, the courage to remain open to having our stories rewritten. The past itself has not changed, the stones are the same, but our understanding of it, the narrative we build from those stones, is undergoing a quiet and profound revolution. This is the ultimate gift of these translations. They do not give us final answers, but better questions. They invite us into a dialogue with our shared human heritage, a dialogue where we must be prepared to be surprised, corrected, and humbled. If you found this rethinking of history fascinating, consider subscribing to delve into more mysteries of the ancient world. Let us know in the comments which empire's story you believe is most in need of a second look. The conversation continues, and your curiosity is the most essential tool of all.